The age of big business. So during the last part of the 1800s and the early years of the 1900s, America was going through a transformation, becoming an industrial nation, expanding, growing, becoming a world power, and business was a large part of what was happening. So the first thing we have to remember is back in the early 1900s and late 1800s, there weren't a lot of rules, laws on the books about business, and a lot of things we think today should be regulated by the government. Then it was wide open. So there weren't a lot of rules. These rules will come as lawmakers in the country realize what's going on. But for example, there were no real rules on what people ate, what the food companies had to tell people who bought the food. You just bought it and you had no idea what was in it, if it was healthy or what ingredients were in it. Same thing with business. Business could just do pretty much what it wanted. There was not a lot of government regulation. Government's really not going to take an active role until early 1900s, maybe a little bit, but mostly during the beginning of the Depression in, say, 1929. So the age of big business, if you look at this slide, you can see some of the things we're going to be talking about: steel and oil, and the idea of companies forming monopolies, and the amount of money that people will make, certain individuals in America. We often think of this time period as the Gilded Age. Gilded means like a thin layer of gold, and underneath that thin layer, nothing of real value. So if you can see from this particular political cartoon, you can see that there are a few rich fat cats on top, based on and sitting upon all the workers at the bottom. And this is mostly true. I mean, the standard of living and the quality of life was rising for most people in America. There was lots of new immigrants coming. So America was still a great place. It's just the gap between the working class and the wealthy was massive. And the folks on top were really, really on top. So it's really hard for us to imagine how wealthy they were when there were so many people who didn't have a lot. So when we think about America today, we tend to thinking of like, maybe three classes: upper class, middle class, and the working class or poor. During the Gilded Age, there might have been only two classes at the time. It's going to take a while for America to find that middle class, people who can work hard and have a decent living, can afford things, go on vacation, get a car, all of that. For this early part of the 20th century, there's a lot of rich people, but there are millions and millions and millions of poor working class people. So Gilded Age just means it's not all as good as it might have appeared on the surface. The wealthy had a great life. There's tales of them lighting their cigars with $100 bills, when most people wouldn't see that much money in a month or 2 months or longer. So the first thing we have to do is talk a little bit about business. So some vocab you might already know. A corporation. This is the first time really in American history with the railroads in the 1800s that we get corporations being formed. So an entity like a company, but really a corporation is treated like a person legally. And so it's a different way of doing business, and this all comes about with the railroads. So if you're part of a company and the company does something wrong or fails, they're not going to come after your own personal money. They're going to go after the corporation's money and assets. And this is a way to protect individuals from wrongs of corporations and yet still provide some relief if there is need for a fine or regulations or something like that. So a corporation is a kind of a new thing towards the end of the 1800s, starting with the railroads, but it'll quickly spread to all aspects of American industrial life, steel, lumber, banking, all of that. And as part of a corporation, there's shares that you can buy and sell. Typically, these when you buy a share of a company, you're getting a small piece. And as the company makes money, the value of the share goes up, and that shareholder, the person who holds a piece of the share, a piece of the company, makes a little bit of money. That's all brand new in this kind of turn of the century era. And when we think of buying stock, we can think of a stock market. So this is an example of one stock market, the New York Stock Exchange, where you could go today and buy a piece of a company or sell a piece of a company. There are several stock markets in the United States and around the world, but this is probably the most famous. So this is all new in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And one of the biggest companies that's going to dominate America and will change America and the world is the Standard Oil Company. So John D. Rockefeller is a businessman who sees the potential of oil and petroleum products. So it's not just motor oil that you would lubricate an engine or that you would burn oil to light up homes and the streets, but also kerosene and all kinds of different petroleum products that would be needed to stay warm or run a business or lubricate engines. And Rockefeller is going to start a company called the Standard Oil Company, and he's going to become the richest man the world has ever known. So Rockefeller is at the forefront of knowing how important oil and petroleum will be to industry and to American life. And of course, as a company, a corporation, they'll sell stock, as you can see on this slide. And Rockefeller will just become immensely wealthy. It's hard for our brains to understand how wealthy he became and how wealthy the company became, because everything really revolved around the Standard Oil Company back then. There were, that was the big company, and any company that went up against it, as we'll see in a moment, the Standard Oil Company either bought, acquired, or crushed. And so in the end, it was the only company standing. But you would need it obviously for your cars. You would need to refine that oil, turn it into gasoline. And all of the boom of the automobile is going to really rely on Standard Oil, the Standard Oil Company. So one of the things we need to know about the Standard Oil Company is that John D. Rockefeller and his company was really good at horizontal integration. So if you look at this chart, you can see that horizontal integration is basically combining all the competition into one giant firm. So now, through a series of stock maneuvers, Rockefeller was able basically to buy up all the smaller oil companies and make them part of the Standard Oil family. And by doing so, this meant great wealth and power. And it was the most powerful corporation in its day. And it was all based on the way John Rockefeller leveraged his company and integrated it horizontally with other oil companies in a way that tended to make those people who ran those companies wealthy, but it made Rockefeller wealthy beyond anything you could ever imagine. So if you look at this particular slide, you can see just the graphic of this is Rockefeller when he's a little bit older. You can see that Standard Oil had a connection to everything in America, from cities to gas stations to everyone's home. It was used everywhere, and it made so much money, and there wasn't much that you could do about anything that Rockefeller did. Now, he didn't make things expensive. He did quite the opposite. He made it very cheap, and so all the competition had no choice either to go out of business or join because they just could not compete with his low prices. And eventually, Rockefeller will form the Standard Oil Trust. So a trust is the next step in the evolution of corporations because it takes a group of companies and makes it into one kind of mega company with one board of directors. And so you can see from this slide an example of a share for the Standard Oil Trust, which just created basically one oil company for America. 90% of all American oil and petroleum products in the early 1900s came from Standard Oil. And so that led people to think, man, is this too much power and wealth for one man and one company? So Rockefeller became the richest person in America. He's probably the richest person that's ever lived. But it also made us think about what the idea of a monopoly is. You've probably seen this board game before. They controlled everything. There was no competition. And so they could do whatever they wanted with prices. If they wanted to raise prices, they could. Consumers had no choice but to go to Standard Oil. And because it was such a needed product, this was not like, say, bananas. This was something that you needed to run your home, your car, your business, your city. The power that Standard Oil had made many people feel that they had just grown too powerful. They were a monopoly. They can control everything. Like in this political cartoon, you can see the octopus of Standard Oil has got its tentacles around Capitol Hill, around the workers, around every part of the United States. The tentacles are heading there towards the White House. You can see on the bottom of this. So this led to the Supreme Court and the federal government to take some action. So early on, the Congress will pass the Sherman Antitrust Act, which meant you just can't make a big, giant trust that would become a monopoly. And then a little later on, they would pass a law called the Clayton Act, which took it to the next level. And in 1914, Congress created the Federal Trade Commission to prevent companies from doing exactly what Standard Oil did. And the Supreme Court will say, you've gone too far in 1911. So the Standard Oil Company, which was on top, gets broken up by the government. So for the first time, we're seeing the government step in and regulate business in a way that we have never seen. Say that the Standard Oil is too big, too much of a monopoly, it must break up. So when you think of a lot of the oil companies today, like Chevron, and there's like 30 some other oil companies that used to be part of the Standard Oil. So we'll maybe talk more about John Rockefeller in a few moments, but he wasn't the only one who was super rich during this time. Banking became huge. So you might have heard of J.P. Morgan. Here's a real picture of him on the right, but he became the inspiration for the monopoly man. A rich banker who just got wealthy off of moving money from bank to bank, interest of the customers. And today that company would be J.P. Morgan and Chase. So if you bank with Chase or your parents bank with Chase, it's still somehow connected to J.P. Morgan. Again, wealthy beyond really what we could really understand today. Of course, another famous person from the time period is Andrew Carnegie and his steel. So whereas Rockefeller did oil, Carnegie did steel. And so he started the Carnegie Steel Company, which would later become the United States Steel Company in Pittsburgh. And so the idea of the steelers comes from this area of the country that produced a ton of steel, and really there was not a lot of competition for the Carnegie steel. He made so much money. Again, super wealthy beyond our understanding. And as opposed to Rockefeller, who did horizontal integration, Carnegie really was more about vertical integration. He bought a lot of the things that helped get the steel made below the company, meaning like a lot of the interest in railroads or a lot of the iron ore or some of the machinery that would be needed. So this example is all about meat production, but you can see that in vertical integration, it's just when you buy the companies that provided the equipment and services that are needed before your factory. So this is what helped Carnegie become super rich. So you got Carnegie, you got J.P. Morgan, you've got Andrew Carnegie. All of these people are so wealthy, but it's easy to judge them and say, well, gosh, it's not fair. And they did have probably too much money, but they didn't keep all their money. During this time period, we're seeing a lot of these wealthy people give away a lot of their money. They got billions and billions of dollars by today's standards, and they give a lot of money away. Rockefeller, for example, started the University of Chicago, and Andrew Carnegie started the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and they would give a lot of money to the community, hundreds of millions of dollars through the course of their life. And Carnegie didn't want to die with any of his money. He wanted to make sure that he used it to benefit society. So here, for example, is Carnegie Hall in New York City. This was built by Carnegie for the benefit of all people. So yes, he was super wealthy. J.P. Morgan, beyond wealth, and Rockefeller, the wealthiest of them all, but they did give back. But it really makes us think that life during the Gilded Age was really great for those on top. It was a rough life for those on the bottom. Life is getting better, but they're still having to work really hard in many times unsafe conditions for low wages just to barely make it. And again, their food isn't the best quality. Nobody's watching over what they eat. Nobody's protecting them while they work. And so we're going to start to see workers become more organized and government take an active role in regulating the workplace and factories.